Huh. They just solved a 60-year-old cold case using snow animation from the Frozen movies.
Oh, that's quirky.
Yeah, it was the Dyatlov Pass incident.
What?
Okay, so it's just thanks to this TikTok that I got thrown into the rabbit hole that is the Dyatlov Pass incident. Again, I know I've seen this before, probably on a BuzzFeed Unsolved video, but the fact that technology has come so far to solve, quote-unquote, the mystery is fascinating to me. So, if you didn't know, February 1959, 9 bodies were found dead in the northern Ural Mountains under uncertain circumstances, and while most suffered from hypothermia due to the freezing winters, 3 were found dead due to physical trauma, and it's a tragedy for sure, but many theories and conspiracies came up because of all these little weird details. So thanks, TikTok. But before we look into that, why not like and subscribe if you want to see more spooks, tunes, memes, me slowly losing my mind. I'll keep this short because it's already really long. So let's go! So, what do we know? Where did this all happen? As I said, it happened in the Ural Mountains, where they established camp on the slopes of Koffeinated Chapter. The way is now referred to as Dyatlov Pass, as we know, and I'll get to why in a bit. It involves the victims of this tragedy. They were 9 Russian hikers, a trekking group who were all experienced from the Ural Polytechnical Institute. They were initially 10, however, one of the members, Yuri Yudin, who left the expedition a day after they had started due to an illness. The group's leader was Igor Dyatlov, and I apologize for all of the rest of these names because if you've watched our Reddit videos, you know that we can't read. There was Yuri Doroshenko, Lyudmila Alexandrovna, Georgy Krivonychenko, Alexander Kolevatov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Rustem Slobodin, Nikolai Brynyoles, and Semyon Zolotaryov. In a short timeline, the expedition or the trek began around January 27, and they were supposed to be heard from again by around February 12. However, they weren't. No one really thought anything about it because delays were common. It's possible that they just took their time or something slowed them down. However, by February 20, the family members demanded that they get a rescue party out there to search for them. And unfortunately, on February 26, they finally found the camp half torn down and their tent cut open from the inside. They also found their diaries and cameras, and it would be way too long to get into them, there's quite a lot, but just to summarize, later on in their expedition, the weather conditions were getting bad and they had lost their direction, so they ended up setting camp around the top of Koffeinated. They'd also found footprints from feet with just socks on or just one boot on. Eventually, they found the bodies of Krivoshenko and Doroshenko. Later on, they also found Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin. By May 4, they had found the other 4 hikers. While most of them died of hypothermia as far as they had observed, there were a few weird details, and these are the details that led to these speculations and weird theories to come up. The first of which was that the first 2 bodies that were found were naked. Their clothes were actually found on 3 of the hikers who were found later. Some of these clothes were also found with traces of radiation, and one of the trousers was torn and burned at the ends. Upon investigation, it also appeared that they had suffered internal trauma, with no visible external injury indicating as to how it happened. Some of these conditions were that Brynyoles had a skull injury, Zolotaryov had severe chest trauma, and his eyeballs were also missing. And Dubinina had suffered from internal bleeding from severe chest trauma. She was missing her eyes, her tongue, part of her lips, facial tissue, and even a fragment of her skull bone. So, what happened to them? There are a lot of theories, but I'm going to focus on 3, from the quite possible, kind of mundane, to the strange and possibly supernatural. The first theory, of course, is that an avalanche had happened. According to this theory, they were rushing to get out of the tent, so they had cut open the tent from the inside. Given the impending avalanche that was coming in, they didn't have time to struggle to put their boots on, hence some of them having just one boot, or no boots at all. rushing to the woods, they hoped that they would get away safely. The problem with this, of course, was that their bodies were not completely covered in the avalanche snow. That and that there was no evidence of a heavy avalanche occurring around this area, and the fact that hundreds of expeditions were held around this area and there were no records to show that an avalanche around this area was even possible due to the terrain and the slope. It also wouldn't explain the radiation on the clothes and the specific missing body parts. Another common theory is that it was the fault of some military conspiracy of some sort. It starts off the same way, except instead of an avalanche, they were awoken by the sounds of explosions. It is true that where they had set up camp was in the path of a Soviet parachute mine exercise. It would explain the burns or the radiation that was on some of their clothes. And it would explain another detail that Yuri Yudin had brought up when he had gone to their funeral. He noted that their skin had a deep brown tan, which I'm guessing is quite unusual if he brought it up. However, it is of course denied heavily, and while it's another plausible theory, this was not what was pinned down either. And now for my favorite theory, which of course involves a cryptid. And it's not uncommon to hear of a strange beast lurking in the mountains that would cause the demise of so many people. But in this case, instead of it being a misplaced sea creature, it is of course the YETI. There is a whole Discovery Channel special called Russian YETI, The Killer Lives, which examines the whole incident through the lens of it possibly being the Yeti's fault, which I find interesting. I'm not sure how they implied that he did it, whether it was a sentient being murdering them and then taking their things, or if it was as if an animal had attacked them. Quite possible, but it doesn't explain a lot of things, such as the lack of footprints from the YETI, or the radiation, and the specifics of why their specific body parts were taken out. So now going back to the TikTok that mentioned Frozen, so what could be the reason? While the case was closed around May 1959, the interest never completely died. It sort of came back up again around 2019, where the investigation continued. And the investigators just so happened to watch Frozen, and they were so fascinated by the snow effects because it was so realistic. So they asked for the animation code, and they used that code to simulate an avalanche. Okay, so they mentioned that an avalanche couldn't have happened. Something that big would have left something, but there was no sign that an avalanche had occurred. But there is a smaller scale to this, a slab avalanche, and they wanted to see if a smaller scale avalanche could cause that much damage. And it turns out it's quite possible. They studied the effects of a slab avalanche on the human body, what its impact could do. And yes, internal trauma can happen without visible physical evidence. This theory follows the first, in that an avalanche had occurred, but given the smaller scale, of course, major injuries were to happen. But it's more likely that the exposure to the elements was eventually what killed them, and that the local animals were the ones that scavenged for their body parts. Now, does this immediately solve everything? Not exactly. It doesn't really explain the radiation on the clothes or the tanned skin, and perhaps technology will later evolve to figure out what happened then. The case isn't fully closed, as of recording at least. I'm gonna ask you, what do you think's the next big, mysterious, unsolvable case that could be solved within the next few years due to our fast progressing technology? But yeah, thanks for watching.